with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Shannon Mattern. And Shannon, thank you so much for joining us today and putting together this talk for us. I'm really excited.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And as Meg said, I'm really sorry I can't join you today. I am in between a couple different trips. And as Meg also acknowledged, it's a little difficult to reach you way up in New York State as a person who's a very nervous driver. So I hope that this virtual participation will be sufficient. Meg and Amy also told me a lot about your mission for today, your goals of what you hope to accomplish with this meeting. So I put this together just for you. I mean, it's not a talk I'd share elsewhere, with the hope that it would serve all the goals that your leaders set forth for you for this meeting. So I'm going to share my screen and show you where to find. I always share all of my publications and course material and presentations on my website. And I'll show you where you can find this particular presentation afterwards, or even during, if you want to follow along. So just one second. Right. Okay, so Meg, could you maybe let me know if you can make sure you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is my website. It's wordsinspace.net. I'm sure Meg can share that with you if you haven't received that already. And this is where you can find pretty much everything I've ever done. I try to make everything as open access as possible. If you go to the index in the presentation section, you'll see a link to today's talk, Public Pedagogy and the Civic Imagination. So now I will start. So, So I'm going to start first of all by assessing our collective impressions. What values and teloi, which is a fancy word that essentially means it's the plural of telos, which means end goals or motivations, characterize contemporary American formal higher education, which I'm including in that category: college, graduate school, professional school, continuing education. Just want you to think about that for a few minutes. I had put a QR code in here, but I think that might be a little bit too complicated. So just want you to think about that a bit. So I will just throw out there, if you look at the way colleges sell themselves, the way our federal and state and local governments sell or promote colleges, most of the end goals for college are to prepare students or to cultivate job readiness, to make students good recruits for well-paying jobs. My particular university, where I find myself right now at the University of Pennsylvania, it seems to me that one of their end goals is to produce students in the highest paying jobs as possible, which doesn't always necessarily align with my values. So utilitarian forms of education seem to be the primary final end goal of a lot of higher education. The values tend to be things like affordability. Well, although most colleges aren't affordable, that's one of the big pushes to make them more affordable. Efficiency, to kind of decrease time to degree, is another big motivation with education reform. Applicability. Many students want to know how any course they take, whether it's a general education requirement or a liberal arts elective, they want to know how it's going to help them in their jobs. So much of what defines higher education these days is about efficiency, productivity, employability, all of these sorts of goals. So it's really, the goals of higher education are really driven by workforce. There's a scholar of higher education at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City named Kathy Davidson, who's written several books about higher education. And I include on this slide, which might be a little bit too small for you to read, some screenshots from her website to show you the variety of projects she's been involved in. She's developed a bunch of curricular initiatives, a bunch of kind of study groups and research centers, including the CUNY Leadership and Peer Mentoring Fellows, a class about, or an organization about structuring equality. She has another program called the Futures Initiative, which you can see on the right is really about designing innovative, equitable futures in higher education, which has gotten a lot of attention around the country. So Kathy has traveled around the country and around the world talking about higher education, largely because the things she has built at CUNY, which really is a marvel of higher education in New York City. It enrolls tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students relatively affordably. It is a huge social economic uplift accelerator, I guess we could say. So it really is a marvel of in the higher education landscape, and Kathy has done some fantastic things there. And in one of her talks about the book you see on the left, The New Education, this is not exactly the most high resolution slide, but I took a screenshot of a video of her talk. She's saying that the industrial education complex, the way the values of higher education that were instilled in the age of industrialism between 1860 and 1925, which still seem to be the most prevalent and salient values for today, are things like mandatory public secondary schooling, various curricular requirements. Not every school can just do whatever they want. We have things like accreditation boards, for instance, that make sure people meet certain standards. Accreditation boards, as you might know, in the current Trump administration are really being weaponized, and we're going to see how that pans out. The rise of the land-grant universities, the SUNY schools, Penn State University, near where I grew up, Cornell is kind of an interesting status in New York State, where you have, it's an Ivy League school and like a public mission university simultaneously. You have the whole concept of a major, a college minor, electives, divisions, certification, grades really come into being. We have so naturalized grades that they almost seem like they're a decree from God, but really they're a relatively recent development, and they were really drawn from industrial production. So people saw, for example, like the meatpacking industry being regulated, where we're assigning grades to meat, and they said like, wow, that's a really great idea. Let's import that into schools too, to let students know how well they're doing. IQ tests, the whole concept of giftedness and learning disabilities, all of these things are relative that we tend to think are so factual and natural that we don't really regard them sometimes as having history, but they are all the product of this era. For better or for worse, I would say some of these things like the reification, the fetishization of IQ, which again we see in the current administration, is not really a good thing because, as you might know, IQ is really connected to the history of eugenics, of deciding who is smart and deserving, who do we want to admit into our country as immigrants and not. So there's been a lot of bad applications towards which things like testing and IQ have been applied. There's been a whole, there is existing a whole vibrant and increasingly vibrant field of study called critical education studies or critical university studies, where people are grappling with these histories, the challenges facing higher education. And we have, these are just a sampling of some books and the various themes or issues they address. Bill Redding's The University in Ruins is kind of a classic of the genre from several decades ago. We also look at the increasing prevalence of bankers and financiers on college boards. I came to the University of Pennsylvania about 2 years ago and was a little bit shocked when I joined a search committee for the new dean of libraries to discover that nearly everybody on the board came from management consulting, real estate development, and finance. Hardly anybody, really nobody, from the humanities, from the arts, from the museum or cultural sectors. So the fact that these particular industries are so heavily represented on our boards and in our alumni networks really shapes the priorities of these institutions. We also have, as you can see in the top right, the rise of the business school, which was really funded and legitimated by the Ford Foundation several decades ago. So the business school is often the biggest major and the most powerful unit of many universities, which shapes the kind of the perception of so many of the other things that are happening at those schools. You might also know Tressie McMillan Cottom's book. It's in the bottom left, where she's talking about the rise of the for-profit college, places like University of Phoenix, for instance, which does a really good job of marketing itself to many disenfranchised and poorer communities, charging a lot of money. And then most of these folks never even finish the degree. So they're tens of thousands of dollars into debt, and then they don't have anything kind of concrete to show for it at the end. We also see the rise of the adjunct underclass. So in the United States, it's well over 70% of most college classes now are taught by people who aren't full-time, who are adjunct instructors. I was at the New School in New York City for about 20 years before coming to Penn, and there 87% of the classes are taught by people who are not full-time. Sometimes this is great because you can get people who are working full-time jobs. I know that the Pratt Information School, for instance, has a lot of adjunct instructors who are practicing librarians and archivists who just come in on the evenings and teach a class and share their professional day job expertise. In many cases, though, a lot of these adjuncts would love to be full-time, and they are often living very difficult existences, piecing together 5 or 6 classes a semester, commuting all over the place, with no office, no home base, just trying to piece together a livable wage, teaching classes all over the place. And then in the bottom right, we see the rising prevalence of surveillance technology. These are issues that I know are pertinent to you in various libraries, both university, public, private libraries. Just the reliance on vendors who can take away subscriptions whenever they feel like it, tracking data, surveillance on various subscription services you might be using. So these are among the concerns in the higher education sector. There are many others that mirror or echo a lot of what are concerns in the library world as well. So addressing some of that, the last class I taught at the new school in 2022, which seemed to be rather prescient, was called Redesigning the Academy. I noticed a lot of disillusionment amongst my colleagues. This was also amidst the part-time faculty strikes, which is one of the biggest labor uprisings at the new school in 2022. And my students were becoming increasingly disillusioned also, wondering once they got their degree, did they even want to work in this sector anymore? They saw how the sausage was made and didn't really like it. So I designed this class about a year before, taught it in 2022, where we thought about not only what challenges we're facing in the academy, and this includes not only, again, everything from continuing education to medical school, but then also I called it redesigning because I was teaching in a program about design, but also because I wanted people not just to complain, but also to think about how we could imagine things otherwise, how we could make it better and what would actually not just a kind of speculative or aspirational, but what we could actually do. So, 2 of our lessons early in the semester, we looked at some of those challenges, including the longer, deeper institutional legacies, like the fact that so many of our oldest schools, most of the Ivy Leagues, if not all of them, are really rooted in slavery, for instance. The land grant universities, as you probably know, are really depended upon co-opting a lot of indigenous lands. So there are a lot of really problematic histories in these institutions. But then we looked at some more persistent contemporary challenges, including some of those I already mentioned to you with the increasing kind of need to promote or to prove a return on investment, increasing costs, the rise of the adjunct class, etc. But then I didn't just want to be kind of a buzzkill to have only room for complaint, but I wanted to think about how things could be different too. So after those lessons, we talked about proposals for reform and reinvention, and we looked at a bunch of other little more experimental projects. Maybe not even little, maybe some big experimental projects that imagined how things could be done differently in a more affirmative and uplifting ways. I just want to highlight one particular image. This is an archival book, little pamphlet cover that I just think is kind of hilarious. It's by a man named Freddie Perlman. It's a booklet he put together. He was an adjunct teaching at, I believe, Wayne State University near Detroit and was let go. And as you can tell, was pretty mad about it. So he produced a whole pamphlet called I Accuse This Liberal University of Terror and Violence. Um, but Freddie Perlman is a really interesting person. He was an economist, and he and his partner, who I believe is a violinist, an interesting pairing, formed what was called the Detroit Printing Co-op, a really cool kind of artist space in Detroit where people could engage in cooperative labor and use for free their equipment to produce all kinds of little tiny publications and little magazines and things of that sort. There's a really fantastic book by Daniel Albert published by Inventory Press, one of my favorite art book publishers, about the Detroit Printing Co-op if you're interested to learn more. I just want to highlight a couple of the theoretical or thinkers about higher education whose ideas have been foundational and continue to be foundational to this day in helping us to think about how education could be done differently or what the challenges are and how we can reimagine it. You might have heard some of these names before, Paulo Freire and then bell hooks. So first from Freire, his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is from 1968. He encourages us to think about when we are engaging in or offering educational services ourselves, are we encouraging a banking mentality versus a problem-posing mentality. Banking is you regard students as essentially piggy banks that you keep dropping little coins into. So it's as if they're kind of receptacles that you fill with information that they then maybe regurgitate on a test or in a job interview. So it regards them as kind of passive receptors of information, not really a dialogic, not really about engaging them or drawing them out or connecting to their own interests. It's really just them being kind of like inert vessels that you fill with information, which, as you can probably tell by the way I'm describing it, he regards as a lesser, not exactly liberatory or inspiring mode of education. Instead, we could pose problems, things that connect students' own inherent interest to challenges in the world, to encourage them to actually bring themselves to the table, bring their insights and passions and experiences to solving larger, actual real-world problems. He also says that knowledge is inseparable from the knower, like the way we design, we have to be aware of what experiences and maybe baggage and challenges people are bringing to the table, to their lived experience, to their sensory experiences. He has a concept called conscientization, which is a part an artifact from the translation from the original Portuguese. But conscientization, which you might imply, or the term might imply, is about developing consciousness. It's developing a critical consciousness of the social and political forces that shape our lives and developing the critical thinking skills to challenge injustice and create change. Education, he also says, is about cultivating virtue and overcoming oppression, and that, he says, is more important than individual advancement and prosperity. So education ideally is about kind of collective, making the world a better place and lifting people out of oppression than it is about me being better than you and getting a job that pays me more than you, which unfortunately is, I think, seems to be the primary telos at my current institution. And then make a look at Bell Hooks. Her book, she's written several books about education. The Teaching to Transgress came out in 1994. She says that education in some cases is to reinforce, we want to think about these pairing or contrasting these models. Education to reinforce domination or education to practice freedom. We can also think about teaching to liberate versus teaching to dominate. She, like Freire, also thinks of pedagogy as a form of active participation, and she builds on what Freire already offered us 3 decades before, and says that we also want to think about not just struggle and kind of political agita as a motivator for education, but also pleasure and excitement. We can cultivate like positive affect. Fun can be a real great motivator. Kindness. It doesn't always have to be like political education doesn't always have to be about kind of seriousness and severity. Pleasure and fun can be an integral part of that too. She, like Fury, also wants to remind us that teaching and learning also happen to us as whole, vulnerable people. So recognizing all the challenges and vulnerabilities and experiences people bring to the table when they're engaged in an educational community. Especially if you, and as part of your network, are developing kind of intentional learning communities where you form yourselves into learning groups. I think recognizing that fun and education and bodies need to eat and move and all of these types of things are really important things to keep in mind. Just an image from the New York Public Library, or from the Harvard Art Museums, which I think is just a fantastic image showing a classroom to remind us that movement and our bodies have to be engaged in these types of things too. Another theoretical kind of foundational text is, I'm not sure if any of you heard of this one, it's by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, called The Undercommons. And this is really coming out of a Black radical tradition. And it's the subtitle is Fugitive Planning and Black Study. I'm just going to read a couple quotes from the book. This is a concept that is really appealing to students and radical faculty or teachers of various kinds who want to take advantage of the resources and wealth of especially our most established and most affluent institutions and spread that wealth out into the world, which is exactly what I will have wanted to do at Penn, is take all of its money and share it with local, less well-resourced community organizations and the public libraries and little startup collections of various sorts. So their argument is the one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can, to abuse its hospitality, to spite its mission, to join its refuge colony, to be in but not of. The subversive intellectual disappears into the underground, the low down maroon community of the university, into the undercommons of enlightenment, where the work gets done, where the work gets subverted, where the revolution is still black. They also, echoing Freire and Hooke, say teaching is merely a profession. We instead think toward a collective orientation to the knowledge object as a future project. What the beyond of teaching is really about is not finishing oneself. It's not about making yourself as employable and polished as possible. It's about allowing subjectivity to be unlawfully overcome by others, allowing yourself to be changed by the experiences and knowledge that the other people in the room with you are bringing to the table. A radical passion and passivity such that one becomes unfit for subjection. So in other words, you're so changed and charged up by this exciting and motivating and empowering learning experience that you become unfit to be subjected to propaganda, for instance, or the maybe unjust disciplining apparatus of the state. I think now that the current federal administration really wants to shape a lot of our libraries and schools into kind of like patriotic machines. We really have to think about how schools, maybe outside of official educational institutions, help to remind students that they do not have to be subject to these party line indoctrination machines. There's critique also that universities have long been indoctrination machines, the machine of woke. So there's a lot of critique among different perspectives on the political spectrum about how we subject students to these ideologies and how education might serve to make them unfit for it or to be able to reject it. Or I'll just stop there. I think I'm doing a little bit too much digression, so I'll just skip down to this last, the middle section here. This is from one of the co-authors, Fred Moten. They really center the concept of study. So what we're doing in their fugitive planning or fugitive school is not teaching and learning. They center this concept of study, which they define as what you do with other people. It's talking and walking around with other people. It's working and dancing and suffering. The point of calling it study is to mark that the incessant and irreversible intellectual, the brain, the cognitive stuff of these activities is always already present. So when you go for your lunch break today and you eat and you sit around tables and talk to each other, that is no less important than what you're doing right now. This is a very traditional educational model. I am supposedly some person with expertise who's talking to you. And because of the limitations of Zoom, it's more a one-way delivery. This form of study is no less valid than what you do in your groups, during your bathroom breaks, or during your lunch conversations. Or when you move around and maybe take walks outside, and I'm hoping you're having a nice day up there where you are today. But that is that is also study, and that is also an intellectually valuable activity. Jack Halberstam, a gender scholar from Columbia who wrote the introduction to this piece, also says in the bottom quote, "Study is a mode of thinking with others separate from the thinking that the institution requires of you. It allows you to spend less time antagonized and antagonizing. So it's not about establishing power dynamics or deciding who knows more or less, or who is more enfranchised or not. Or it's not about grandstanding or demonstrating your expertise to people. It's instead about a more collaborative, mutually supportive form of engagement and mutual learning." So how have these principles been put into practice? So I'm going to show you a bunch of examples. And what we'll go through first is look at a couple historical precedents. Then maybe we'll look specifically at some examples within the library world, so library learning communities, both historical and contemporary. Then we'll talk about how we can think about learning as how we can cultivate or design different modes of gathering, what form these learning communities could take. And hopefully this will be useful to you to think about what you might be able to build. And then we'll look beyond kind of the genre of gathering to think about what tools we can make to foster community learning. So this is linked to from my slide deck, but it's also available through my website. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the platform called Arena. It's a really great collections management, less sophisticated and official than what you use in the library world. But this is a lot of artists and librarians use this collection management thing. This is a very zoomed out screenshot of my collection of para-academic institutions. So I looked around and found other people's collections, brought them into mine, my own contributions of dozens of examples of historical and contemporary communities that have tried to find alternative models of education. This is just a slightly zoomed in version here. You can see how some of these image thumbnails might give you a little bit of a taste of what I have in this collection. Everything from the Island School of Social Autonomy to creating an Institute for Sustainable Worlds to the Center for Planetary Pedagogies to Footnotes Summer School to the World End School of Thought. So if we look through history, one of the earliest examples would be the Mechanics Institutes, which sometimes had a free library in them. They really started in Glasgow and the UK in the early 19th century. And parallel to that a little bit, this was really about promoting practical education, helping people to develop skills and knowledges that would be useful on the job, in the trades particularly. Also, parallel to that, a couple decades later, we have the rise of the Lyceum movement, which is really about cultural, artistic, and humanities-oriented education and public forms of education. The lecture became a very prominent thing. You might have heard of things like the Lincoln-Douglas debates, or if you know anything about the history of the Cooper Union Building in New York City, that is where the Lincoln-Douglas debate happened, where so many famous lectures happened. The lecture circuit was really big in the 19th century, and you can see here two publications looking at the lecture as something that was like a traveling show that went around to different cities in the United States, and also especially in kind of the Victorian area England. So this is more that sage on the stage model of education, where you have luminary figures coming and standing on a stage and imparting their knowledge to a public who, interestingly, would choose to give up the little free time they had to go to be lectured at or to learn from a lecture. So just the prevalence of lectures everywhere happening in the mid-19th century is quite an interesting historical phenomenon. Then another interesting part of New York history, we have the Chautauqua movement. And a couple different books published by that, started in 1874, was very prominent until it still exists today, but its prominence died or declined a bit in the early 1900s with the rise of radio and other forms of mass media. I'm just going to play a little clip of a video just to allow some of the historians who are more familiar with this tradition than I am to give you a bit of a sense of what it is all about. But this is really a precursor to intentional voluntary learning communities, some of which have some connections to existing librarians and athenaea and lyceums in their towns.
This place was founded in 19th century America, and both of those qualifications are very important. It was 19th century and it was America.
The Chautauqua Lake Sunday School Assembly began in 1874, at a time when religion, science, and politics were merging with a new social activism.
When Chautauqua started, it was still in the wake of the Civil War. There were many changes to the demographics, changes to the economy, changes to the political structure.
In response to those changes, John Hyle Vincent, a Methodist minister, and Lewis Miller, an Ohio industrialist, started Chautauqua as an educational experiment.
These were programs to teach Sunday school teachers how to teach Sunday school better. It was part of the Sunday school movement of the time, which was much more than just simply teaching people about the Bible.
They believed that if democracy was to succeed, you had to have an educated electorate. And they believed that the churches had some responsibility for that.
Chautauqua benefited from the increased leisure time that many Americans were beginning to experience.
People were working very hard in 19th century America, and it was considered not quite appropriate or American to take a vacation, particularly if you just went off and did nothing. But if you went on vacation where you had elevating lectures given, or religious services, or religious education, then it became a little more acceptable.
For their summer encampment, Miller and Vincent settled on a remote area of western New York.
And both men came to realize that actually by moving it away from the cities and holding these events in a natural setting, it actually made for a better classroom.
I thought I included a stop point, but it didn't automatically stop there. Anyway, a couple other examples around that same time, and I know that you in upstate New York, I'm sure you're benefiting from some, or I hope you are benefiting from some of the cooperative extension programs of your university. I know Cornell has offices and programs all around the state. I lived up in Columbia County, a couple counties north of the city, for several years, and there was a Cornell Extension campus that offered things like master gardener classes and all types of practical education. So the rise of agricultural extension. I grew up in central Pennsylvania where Penn State was located. There, they not only have like dozens of branch campuses around or satellite campuses around the state, but also tons of extension programs as well. So this is a kind of another example of public education of people who choose voluntarily to join these learning communities was a product of the late 19th, early 20th century. Another interesting thing that happened in between the wars was the public forum program. This was a product of Des Moines, Iowa, where a man developed this whole set of public forums for both youth and adults that was really about promoting democratic education. And some of these, as Meg mentioned, I was the Kluge Chair in Modern Culture at the Library of Congress this past semester. And just looking through the prints collection there, they obviously have all the, maybe not obviously, but they do have all the WPA posters from the New Deal era. And these were among really fascinating ones. You can see from these posters that they held these forums in places like the YMCA. On the far left, it says you can see your daily newspaper to find out where these meetings are happening. So you can see this whole local ecology of public information happening. It would be the events would happen at the public library or the YMCA or the YWCA or maybe the local school. You'd tune into the radio or the newspaper to find out when things were happening. In some cases, you'd have a public forum on the radio and then meet in your public library to discuss it later. So this whole ecology of no local institutions, media and culture institutions working together to ideally promote an informed electorate. This is a book about these phenomena, and as I said, it really started in Des Moines, and they wanted to try to extend this throughout the country. I'm just going to read this last paragraph here. In many ways, the whole program replicated the extension system through its use of educators and communities. But it never really achieved the status of a training ground for national citizenship had been hoped. But it did encourage 2.5 million citizens who participated in 23,000 discussions within just a 5-year period, which is pretty amazing. I also found in the W.E.B. Du Bois collection at Amherst College a form that you would submit to the Department of Interior Office of Education to ask for resources to host your own public forum. So you wanted to have a public forum about, I don't know, the state of water infrastructure in our community, or how to, what we want visions for our local newspaper. You would submit this form asking for how many researchers you would need, how many secretaries, how many writers and artists you would need at some amount per month, and then they would give you a budget for it. So I can't imagine that happening today, especially with the state of our federal funding agencies. But this is quite aspirational to think that such a thing is possible. Then we also have places like Black Mountain College. Over this very same time this was happening in the 1930s, we had experimental art schools forming. This is in rural North Carolina. I'm not sure if many of you have heard of this institution before, but I'll play a couple minutes of this video.
Rice was very influenced by the educational philosophy of John Dewey. Dewey was a member of the board of trustees of the college for a period and believed in what the college was doing. What was that? That was essentially adopting Dewey's philosophy of learning by doing and adapting it to higher education. So most pre-K programs in the United States and lots of other places in the world essentially use a Deweyan philosophy. That is, they believe that children learn best by doing things, making things, drawing things, singing things, and so forth. And that was very much Dewey's idea. Dewey thought that you get a lot more knowledge out of actually working with things in the world with your hand and your mind than you do passively listening to somebody talking or reading a book. Dewey was the leading public intellectual, among philosophers anyway, in the United States in the progressive period, the period around the First World War and after. among other things, he was the heir to the pragmatic tradition, which he got from William James, whom he knew. Charles Purcell was his teacher, Oliver Wendell Holmes, whom he greatly admired. And his philosophy of education is connected with that. It's not just pragmatic, but it's very much consistent with the pragmatic idea that the way our minds work has to do with our adaptation to the environment. That's why we have minds to begin with. It helps us cope with the world. So if you think about how we acquire knowledge, we do acquire knowledge by trying to deal with the environment that we find ourselves in. That's a very pragmatic idea.
So what's the thrust that he brings to Black Mountain College?
So how do you make that work in higher education? That's the question. Because you're trying to study subjects like history, sociology, science, and so forth. I mean, what does it mean to actually learn by doing when you're trying to learn those kinds of areas of knowledge? And Rice decided that what it meant was that no matter what students did, and it was an incredibly permissive school, you could take any courses that you wanted, you had to do something involving arts practice. You had to take a painting course, a weaving course, a sculpture course, a photography course, a dance course, something that actually involved you physically in the act of making something. And that wasn't because Rice wanted to produce artists and sculptors and dancers and photographers. It's because he wanted to produce citizens. And he thought that if you have to make something, you have to make choices all the time when you're creating a picture or a dance or a piece of weaving, whatever it might be. And learning how to make choices independently is very important for democracy.
So if you don't know much about Black Mountain, some of the names of people who passed through there, taught there, or were students might resonate for you. Joseph and Annie Albers. Annie Albers is a great weaver. There's a fantastic show called Weaving Histories up at the Museum of Modern Art right now that features a lot of Annie Albers' work. So they were amongst the faculty there. John Cage, the experimental composer, Merce Cunningham, the dancer, choreographer, William and Elaine de Kooning, the famous kind of abstract expressionist painters, Charles Olson, the poet, Buckminster Fuller, the experimental architect. All of these amazing names passed through Black Mountain College, and they had a farm. So there was just the idea of learning through doing, through art, and working with the earth. It was all an integral part of the pedagogy, and you learned larger transferable lessons through these activities. There's also a kind of around the same time again, not an explosion, but a proliferation of communist colleges. So I'm just going to read this middle section here. In the mid-1940s, the Communist Party of the United States helped to establish a robust network of adult education in New York and about a dozen other U.S. cities. Distinct from mainline forms of higher education, these institutions were devoted to economic, social, and political democracy for the people, a popular front euphemism for the ideals of mid-century communists, many of whom were on academic blacklists. So you had this, again, a spread of adult education to try to teach some of the philosophy central to 1930s and 40s communism. There's also a whole history of experimental, not even call it that, it was a alternative education for Black communities. And largely that was because they were officially excluded from mainline or mainstream education. So on the left here we see the late 19th, early 20th century history of the Rosenwald schools. So Julius Rosenwald funding the building of schools, particularly in the American South, the segregated South. And then we have the freedom schools, which are really connected to the civil rights movement. And not only for Black communities, but also for indigenous communities, as you can see on the right. So I'm going to, again, play a short clip of a video with people who know this history better than I do.
One of the most wonderful things about 1964 Mississippi summer were the freedom schools.
The state of Mississippi deliberately and systematically kept Black people uneducated and ignorant, and then turned around and made education a requirement in order to participate in the political process. We were able to do the freedom schools in the summer of 1964 because we had almost 1,000 students coming to the state of Mississippi, thus the human resources to actually, conduct classes.
We hope to find and develop and mold local leadership among the young people. We also hope to promote a better self-image among the local Negroes.
So I'll just stop there. I mean, part of that was teaching people about Black history, which was not something that was part of standard curricula, excuse me. The Black Panthers also had really made a radical kind of contribution, and I don't mean that in the pejorative sense of radicality, but a really valuable foundational contribution through their Oakland Community School. There's a video link at the bottom if you want to engage with this slide deck and watch more about it. But they're really credited with producing a one-of-a-kind school, the Oakland Community School. They also were strong proponents of school lunch. They provided free school lunch and breakfast to their students, which was novel at the time, wasn't brand new. Other people were doing it, including the Philadelphia School District. There's actually an exhibition here in Philadelphia right now about the history of the school lunch, which looks at the prescience of the Philadelphia School District in offering food to students. But the Black Panthers really popularized that and made a huge impression around the country. They used also restorative practices and alternatives to discipline. So thinking about like paddling students might not be the best way to encourage, positive behaviors. So thinking about restorative justice, which is very prominent in recent days, but a lot of that started here. I also just want to call out the book. This is freely available online by Eli Meyerhoff, looking at the whole, as you can see, 5 different examples of alternative schools, many of which were kind of offshoots of universities, many graduate students and adjuncts who form their own experimental satellite programs. Also, I just wanted to highlight this. I found this in the archives at the Library of Congress looking through the Charles and Ray Eames collection, the designers. People would send them a lot of correspondence, and friends would send them catalogs from experimental education institutions. I hadn't heard of this one before. It's called the Workshop for Learning Things, which I love, that is just the simplicity and invitational nature of its name, based in Watertown, Massachusetts. And here are just some of the workshops. The graphic design is fantastic. They're really putting into play the things they teach there, including using stamps and printing. They do a lot of construction experimentation with cardboard, as you can see in the top right. So just the proliferation of similar programs in the 1960s and 70s in particular. We also have the Mangrove School. There's lots of international examples of things happening too. This is from Guinea-Bissau. So it's amidst the Portuguese colonization of that territory or that country in the 1960s and 70s, when many Bissau Guinea locals would retreat into the mangrove swamps because their root structure provides kind of like a shelter and a platform that one can stand on. They reconstituted the root structures into tables and desks and had school in the mangrove swamps. So there's a really great documentary that you can see here about the whole history of the mangrove school. Many publications. This is just a highlight of the 3 of the many publications that are documenting and chronicling and kind of encyclopedically some similar alternative, particularly art schools. I wanted to highlight this one. When I participated in, it doesn't exist anymore, which is why I had to find its website on the Wayback Machine. And it's not a live website anymore, but this was called the Public School, formed by a bunch of artists in Los Angeles that then went to several cities around the country, including New York, where people would propose, I want to learn about something. Maybe I can teach a class about it. Who can I bring in who has some expertise in it? So it was really self-formed classes. I learned about it because back in maybe 2010 or something, I participated in a class called Page to Screen, where we had librarians and graphic designers and all kinds of people come together, and we took amazing field trips behind the scene places to learn about the transition from print to digital publication. It was so fantastic. I was then asked to teach a class about pneumatic tubes. I had written an article about the history of pneumatic tubes, especially as they exist in libraries. Roosevelt Island in New York City has a pneumatic tube trash kind of waste system. So I did a talk class about pneumatic tubes. So we were walking around touring the pneumatic tube system in Roosevelt Island. So there's a lot of potential with things like this. They're a little hard to sustain though, because it's mostly volunteer labor, which is telling that, this program doesn't exist anymore. A similar program organized by 2 friends of mine, Caroline Woolard and Orr Zabalski, was called Trade School, where it was like a barter skills development program. You want to learn how to make a dovetail? Well, I know how to make a great souffle. If you teach me what you know, I'll teach you what I know. So it was a kind of a bartering system for teaching trades. There's also the whole rise of this is not a new phenomenon, but people's assemblies, largely coming out of political education. I forgot to put a slide in here. There's actually a people's assembly happening next Saturday at a church in Greenpoint that am part of a group that is organizing it, about helping people in New York City understand more about their public libraries and how they're funded and how they can support them. So these are large gatherings drawing on experts from various sectors to educate anybody in the public who's interested, coming to a third space somewhere to learn about something in their communities. And then we can ask, what about learning communities are for librarians, or those meeting at or extending from or inspired by the library? So Metro, the library council that I work with, its new website is coming next week. This is a screenshot of the old website. Has a bunch of continuing education programs, including things like interlibrary loan, special interest group, a community chat, a special of highlighting the collections of various members, including here the International Center for Photography. You also, as I'm sure you know, have continuing education offerings. The American Library Association has a core CE calendar with continuing ed opportunities. The Urban Libraries Council, which I'm not sure that you would be a member of, but they have just launched this thing called the ULC Academy, which offers a variety of professional education classes about things like being a branch manager, for instance. You might also know about the Library Juice Academy, which has classes about things like AI and libraries for skeptics, developing an archives collection, online instructional delivery, inclusive instructional design, things like that. And then if you're a special collections librarian, or a rare book librarian, you might know about the Rare Book School, which happens at the University of Virginia every summer. And that is a very nichely specific school offering professional education and historical academic framing for librarians and archivists. Speaking of libraries or schools in the library, Brooklyn has a partnership with Bard College, which is up in Annandale on Hudson, north of the Hudson River. They have a Bard Micro College, which, as you can read here, brings high quality, full scholarship, liberal arts education to those communities most often excluded from the university experience. So you can get an associate's degree through college classes offered at the Brooklyn Public Library, which then you can transfer into, if you want a full Bachelor's of Science or Bachelor of Arts degree at Bard, you can do that, or transfer it to another university. So this is a great way to get people in a space that maybe doesn't feel intimidating or as geographically inaccessible as a formal college and economically inaccessible. So just start taking free classes at their local library that they can then stop there with that or translate into something else. I also just wanted to highlight this. This is from the DC Public Library. They have a really fantastic local history collection on their 4th floor. And there they've worked with a New York-based artist or a designer to create a district catalog, which is just really recognizing and encouraging people to share their local information, to add it to their own catalog, to remind community members that your knowledge matters and is worthy of preservation and organization into our collection too. Brooklyn also has a thing called University Open Air, where they take immigrant teachers, professors, and academics who were trained outside the United States, who aren't able to work in higher ed in the United States. I can't tell you how many cab drivers I've had over the years, or delivery drivers, who were professors or lawyers or engineers in their home countries, who are now delivery gig workers in the United States. This gives them a chance to share their expertise through this summer program in the parks, in Prospect Park, in partnership with the library. There's also a collective called Library of Study, which takes a little mobile collection and has various thematic classes that they pop up in various parks around the city. I've written about some similar projects through 2 different articles over the years. I wrote about little pop-up libraries, the little free libraries, and what librarians think of them in an article from 2012. And then in 2019, I wrote a piece about the history of segregation in libraries, which has compelled or invited many communities of color to develop their own fugitive libraries, their own undercommons, to go back to that theme we talked about earlier. We also want to think about what other genres of gathering lend themselves to collective study. We've talked about people having universities in maybe more accessible spaces, public libraries. We've talked about pop-up libraries and classes going out to the public parks. But what else might we imagine? What topology, which is a mathematic term, which means kind of like a network architecture of togetherness, do you want to foster? What vibes? Vibes matter a lot. Do you want it to be serious and formal? Or do you want, like, the fact that you're all sitting in rows staring at me really shapes the way we are engaging in collective education right here. If we were in small tables, that would be a totally different form of knowledge exchange. If we were in a vibrant artistic space with food and a little bit of clamor, that would be very different than being in a formal silent room. These are all the vibes that really matter in cultivating a learning experience. What are the spatial and temporal parameters of each genre? You all are given half a day, maybe. I'm not sure how late you go today. But what if instead it was like 5 sessions spread throughout a couple months, some on Zoom, some online? How you stretch something out temporally and spatially really shapes who can participate and the nature of the learning that can happen there. I also have another arena channel. I don't expect you to be able to read this. I just want to show you that it exists, of the interesting examples of thinking creatively about the gathering, of cultivating the gathering, of organizing events as an artistic and a pedagogical form and practice itself. There's a whole bunch of literature, both academic literature and artistic practice about this. Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, used the small conference as actually a field site. She analyzed through ethnographic accessibility the small conference as a site worthy of investigation. There's the whole history of happenings, like Alan Caprow and other conceptual artists from the 1960s organized a genre of event called the happening. What if a library had a happening? There are lots of artists and designers thinking about the lecture as something that doesn't have to be boring and unidirectional. So people thinking about how can we punk or really rethink the lecture itself. The meeting, which seems to be steeped in like bureaucratic boringness and administrative tedium, can be really creatively rethought. There's a fantastic book called Freedom is an Endless Meeting about the whole history of consciously and creatively organizing meetings for social movements. And then you can see on the right here a bunch of examples of different arts organizations thinking about the medium. And I just got this zine a couple weeks ago from the Bathers Library in the San Francisco Bay Area about a whole class about how can we rethink what a meeting is. A couple other examples, there's a lecture series called Tables of Contents, which brings together readers, or authors to share their work over a curated menu. So the value of food being central to an event is a really way to cultivate a vibe that shapes the kind of learning that happens. The office party. I have two of my friends have a whole research practice about thinking about how we can think about the office party as something that can be curated and cultivated in interesting ways. In the middle, you see this blog post that kind of got some pretty wide distribution about stoop coffee. 2 people started to just make a ritual of having coffee on their stoop in the morning, which just drew the rest of the street out to do that together. What similar types of rituals could you do in your libraries and archives to cultivate different modes of gathering? Other scholarship about hospitality and toolkits and all kinds of interesting stuff to draw on to think more creatively about these things. So if we were to think beyond the gathering, what tools or infrastructures can we deploy to build learning communities? The syllabus is one thing that I love to think with. I dedicated a whole class to the syllabus in my Redesigning the Academies class. This is a really fantastic I guess you could call it not a graphic novel, a graphic book by the cartoonist Linda Barry, using the syllabi in her classes. I again have an arena channel of a whole bunch of different people who've thought creatively about the syllabus. A couple other examples, you can see in the bottom right, a spread from inside Linda Barry's book. The top left, there's a project called the Syllabus Project where people can share creative syllabi that aren't for an existing class. They could just be a class that you love to see exist. They could be purely imaginative and speculative. So it's reimagining the syllabus as this bureaucratic document that tells you what you have to read when and how you can fail and pass this class. Instead saying, here's a document that offers a bunch of exciting resources that we can engage with together to learn together. On the right, top left, sorry, on the top right, you can see a librarian, I think it was Ashley Brewer, created a syllabus for the whole TV show, Halt and Catch Fire. So if we watch that show together, what can we read alongside it to learn about the history of tech culture in the 1980s? Toolkits also. We could think about building, and lots of libraries have developed toolkits that people can take away and engage in their own learning communities. Here are a couple examples of that. I wrote an article about the repair manual on the, as you can see on the right side, which could be a genre you can play around with too. And here's just another example of one of thousands of books that exist that could be of use, providing examples of exercises, manuals of exercises that engage people in collective learning. I already mentioned the toolkit, but here are some more resources about the toolkit. I also wrote an article about the history of the toolkit. So, to wrap up here, how do various topics and TLOI, again, meaning end goals or purposes, participation models, and distribution needs, like whether we're creating a manual for disaster preparedness or networking with community partners to serve our most vulnerable populations or building a community newsroom, for instance. How do all these different considerations call for particular pedagogical structures? Do you need a seminar? Do you need a workshop? Do you need to share a toolkit? Do you need a one-day conference? Do you need a bunch of Zoom webinars? How do they call for different structures and tools and sites and durations? Should it be a day? Should it be a morning? Should it be a whole semester? Should it be stretched out over a year? And ambiances. Should it be formal or informal or fun? Or should there be noise? Or should kids and food be welcomed? These all are decisions that matter. What values do different learning assemblages promote? How might they cultivate hospitality, incentivize long-term investment, promote collaboration, offer security and support, or whatever other values we want to prioritize in these situations? What lessons might we learn from designing particular learning assemblages amongst our librarian and archivist communities, which we could then apply in serving our publics? So that's all I have for you today. It's probably more than enough. The slide